Welcome to Cover Book Beat. I'm your host, Roger Nichols, and this is author interview number 873. And our guest today couldn't find a book of the kind he really liked. You know the kind, book that's epic in scope, spans generations, and is rich in character. So he decided to write one. The result is the novel Bungalow Terrace, which not only checks all the boxes, but does so with both style and, more importantly, heart. It spans the last half of the 20th century, follows four boys from their early days in a strict Catholic grade school through their discovery that they could make beautiful music together to high-flying career as rock musicians and the complications that follow. Our guest, Robert Monroe, knows this world well. He worked as a casting director and a talent executive for a dozen years, including projects with the Walt Disney Company and United Paramount Network. He is also a museum exhibited photographer. Bungalow Terrace is his debut novel, but given the level of artistry exhibited here, we predict a rosy future for him. Very pleased to welcome Robert Monroe.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm very happy to be here, Roger. Thank you for inviting me.
Your career took you other places at first, but were you always in the back of your mind going to be a writer?
Um, I don't think so. I mean, I knew, particularly when I was younger, that I had a certain capacity for writing. I
Mhm.
remember when I was in high school and in college, whenever I would receive a paperback, there would always be some sort of comment on it, like, well written, couldn't put it down, very entertaining, that sort of thing. But at that time, I was very involved in the theater.
Mhm.
And that's really the direction I wanted my path to go. So as you mentioned, I was a casting director and a talent executive. And then in 1999, I moved to the state of Maine to become a photographer. But the one thing I realized when I was writing Bungalow Terrace was that I wouldn't have been able to write a novel that ambitious if those two other incarnations had not preceded it.
Mhm.
Um, because becoming a casting director gave me a specific point of view, and it allowed me to develop a very discerning sort of subjective eye, which is very essential for my photography. And then as a photographer, I realized that my work was primarily conceptual. All of
Mm.
my exhibitions were a story. They always had a beginning, a middle, and an end, and they were constructed that way. I felt that each of the photographs worked individually, but they were sort of individual chapters to a specific story, which was essential when I decided to write Bungalow Terrace.
Okay. I have to ask because I have a chance to talk to a real life casting director.
Yeah.
Just have to ask
Okay.
this one question about that background. How do you know when you find the right person for the part? I mean, is it a logical balancing of adding up all the pluses and minuses, or is it just like a gut feeling like, oh, this person is it?
Um, well, at a certain point, you kind of know the talent pool, and then you
Mhm.
also collaborate with a number of people. You collaborate with agents, and you collaborate with a variety of different people. You're given some sort of breakdowns to know what the director and/or the client is looking for.
Mm.
Um, but in terms of casting, I believe that most directors hire specific casting directors because they prefer their particular taste,
Oh, okay.
or they are sort of in sync. They're simpatico in terms of what it is they're looking for and what it is that your particular eye can discern. So it's sort of a collaboration of everything. But then it's also the job of the casting director to think outside of the box.
Mm.
Um, Instead of sticking strictly to the breakdown per se. That's where the creative part of it is. Did you ever think of this individual, or did you ever think of this individual? And that can reign over, many demographics. Um, so it really is a collaboration, and it's trusting your instincts, and it's knowing the talent pool, and it's bringing the best people in that you feel would be right for the part.
Fascinating, fascinating. Was there a triggering incident or series of incidents that said, okay, I'm done with this. I really have to focus on my photography to make a pun?
Yeah, I mean, I had always been an amateur photographer. Um, and I would say probably around 1997, I was beginning to sort of wane in terms of what it was I was doing theatrically. It was no longer exciting me. I was no longer being stimulated by it. I just felt it was time on some level to move on. I thought that, it had run its course. I was very happy with the career that I had, but I knew that I wanted to do something else. Um, and so I actually left the business, And I took a couple of years off to decide what it was I was going to do. And I actually took a trip to Ireland. It was actually a photographic trip with the Center for New York Photography. And I just, once again, I felt immersed in it. I fell in love with it. At that time, it was creatively the most satisfying thing I had ever done. And so that's when I decided, okay, I need to be serious about this. And I decided to go back to graduate school for photography. And that's kind of where it started. That's what brought me to Maine. I went to the Maine College of Art for studio arts.
Oh.
And in the interim, I got together with a group of photographers and we created this wonderful organization called the Bakery Photographic Collective, which was a group of photographers who initially we created it somewhat selfishly. We needed a place to work. So we created this very comprehensive darkroom space where you could do analog photography, work in the dark room. We also had a color dark room. We also had digital facilities. And it sort of grew from that, where we started doing exhibitions, et cetera, et cetera. And then I just, started doing my work and presenting them to galleries and to curators. And one thing led to another. And I believe that, I had accomplished what I wanted to accomplish in that particular arena.
Mm-hmm.
And how I came to write Bungalow Terrace now seems very synchronistic. It seems like Kismet was somehow involved, but at the time, it seems sort of arbitrary, like happenstance. It was very late at night, and I was sitting at my kitchen table, and I'd had a very, very, very difficult day, and I was sort of questioning everything, and I was beginning to question whether or not I wanted to continue with my photography.
Mm-hmm.
And the first line of the novel popped into my head, which was they grew up on the same street, a street called Bungalow Terrace. And at the time, I didn't think that much of it. I didn't really know what it was, but I remember saying at the time to myself, well, that would be a great way to start a novel. And then I let it go. But as with every great inspiration I've ever had, it wouldn't let me go. And before I knew it, this story started formulating in my head. I'd be in the grocery store or I would be driving down the turnpike, and the construction of it began to happen. Certain dialogue scenes, certain aspects of the plot line. So one night I decided, okay, well, just write something, because I was still somewhat in resistance to it. I said, sit down and write something and see how you feel about it. And I wrote a facsimile of what is now the first chapter. And once again, out of everything I've ever done creatively, it was even, photography to theater, it was ultimately the most satisfying experience I ever had. I just immersed myself in it. I felt so stimulated and creatively fulfilled. I sent it to a person who I trusted. I said, what do you think of this? They gave me some notes, but they said, the thing you should look at is the fact that I want to know more. I'd like to read the next chapter. I want to know what happens. So it was then I decided that I was going to write the book, and I got very serious about it, very disciplined about it. It wasn't something I did, sort of in between my photography or on the weekends, etc., because I knew it would take a tremendous amount of research. And instead of one, main character, I actually had four. So I obviously had to develop an outline for each one, as if I was writing an individual book, and then blend them together. But that's how it all started.
Wow, that is fascinating. But I've also mentioned, you mentioned something I want to touch on, and that is the eye that you have for detail that came
Yeah.
up in both the previous careers is a huge help to you in this because your detail is spot on all the way through.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you. I think that came from, I've always been an avid reader.
Mm.
And well, I guess you could also attribute it to, going to the movies, watching a television show. And it would sometimes make me a little crazy when something would happen or there would be an aspect of the novel and I had a question at the end of it. For
Mhm.
example, I remember one specific book I was reading, and there was a character that I absolutely fell in love with in the beginning part of the novel. And then he just disappeared. And there was no explanation in the book as to where he went, what happened to him, what the through line of his end storyline was.
Yeah.
And I remember feeling very, very disappointed. And so when I was writing Bungalow Terrace, I said, I don't want the audience on any level to feel disappointed. I don't want there to be any questions at the end of it. I don't want it to be ambiguous. Not that I didn't leave things up to the reader's imagination, of course I did, but at the same time, I didn't want there to be any questions as to, well, what happened? What was the resolution to this particular storyline or this plot line or this particular fact? So I worked really hard at making sure that there weren't any questions at the end of the novel.
Well, I want to say there's a lot to dissect here. I can see this being taught in freshman 101 lit class. You've got not only one, but four coming of age stories. You've got a rise to fame story from multiple angles. You've got commentary on class, race, and sexual orientation, set against a timeline of popular music from doo-wop to disco to dubstep, and all of it wrapped up in sex, drugs, and rock and roll. But the thing that really makes us shine is the heart of the story. It feels as if that was your goal all along.
Yes, it was. That was the most important thing to me, was that when the audience read it, that they felt something, that I had created at least some sort of empathy or understanding in terms of the different characters and being able to allow the audience to walk in those particular shoes. I know that when I view or read or experience anything, I want to have some sort of visceral emotional response to it. And I really wanted the characters to be real people. I didn't want any heroes. I didn't want any villains. I didn't want any sort of stock characters.
Mhm.
I wanted everybody just to be human. And I'm a firm believer that, we can all relate to each other from that point of view. Um, and even though you may not have the same experience that I have, or you have, or somebody else has, um, that sort of emotional response to any given situation is universal. And I really wanted that to be the experience of the writer. I really, really did. I wanted them to feel something. And the way that I did that was I sort of went back to all of my old acting exercises. I sort of did these sort of sense memory exercises. And I realized that if I couldn't emotionally relate to what I was writing, what the character was going through in that particular moment, then it wasn't going to read authentically to the audience. So even if it wasn't an experience that I had, I would find some substitute in my own life to sort of substitute for it and then sort of dredge up all of that emotional baggage and sort of then write the piece.
Mhm.
So it was very cathartic for me in writing it as well, because it allowed me to get in touch with a lot of things within my own life and my own experience, and sort of reconcile them in order to make it authentically written on the page.
Okay. We're going to be talking about that in a moment, but I got a couple of things to get to first before that,
Sure.
because if I don't do my checklist, I'm going to miss the cool, some of the
Okay.
cool stuff. I'm focused on that. One of the things, I'm an old disc jockey, and I love your knowledgeable selection of music, the background music for each period, authentic, including your Cheating Heart, I believe. How much is that doggy in the window? Graduation Day, but I knew you really were a person who went deep into the recesses when you came up with Cat Mother and the All Night Newsboys and good old rock and roll, a one-hit wonder that should have been a lot better and a lot more. So thank you for that, for a little bit of something for the old time rock and rollers like myself.
Well, you're welcome. That all came up in the research,
Mhm.
particularly the research I did on the Electric Circus, which was this very popular, enormous club during the late 1960s. And they played there quite often.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Also, I want to mention other cultural references. I mean, you have one of the characters says, "Ha ha, you're a regular Milton Berle," which goes back very far ways. And then you mentioned the Ted Mack amateur, but we're really one of the other things that focused on me is you mentioned that our group played at the Buddy Dean show in Baltimore and the Clay Cole show in New York and American Bandstand. I never heard of the other two because American Bandstand, for some reason, out of Philadelphia, went nationwide where the New York show didn't. So
Right.
your research was spot on, I'll tell you.
Yeah, I mean, I did a tremendous amount of research because I really wanted it to read authentically to people who were around during that particular time.
Mhm.
And just in terms of I guess hierarchy of shows, I mean, American Bandstand was the most popular and most people understand what that was. But you don't always start at the top.
Mhm.
I mean, there's sort of an incremental level in terms of media that you're going to be exposed to when you're sort of, climbing that ladder of success. And so I wanted it to read authentic, that it wasn't just like, oh, they became a band and then went on American Bandstand, because
Yeah.
that's not the reality of it.
Yeah.
And that's certainly something I realized, when I was working in television,
Yeah.
that, there are certain levels that you sort of need to reach before you climb up to sort of that sort of apex or pinnacle to media.
There's a wonderful moment where the boys walk into the theater for the first time, a really grand theater, and you compare it to the Wizard of Oz changing from sepia to full color. That's an echo of your background in the music industry or the cinema industry, but it's also a really great way to get that feeling of wonder that they must have had at the moment.
Right, right. Yeah, and that was actually based on an actual theater that
Mm.
I sort of had that experience when I was a child, and my mother and father took me to that theater for the first time because at that particular time it was a movie theater, and we went to that theater, and when I walked in, it was as if I had walked into the most magical set, the most magical experience I had ever had in my life. And I always remembered that feeling of awe. I mean, the intricate carvings on the pillars and, these enormous dome-shaped ceilings that were painted with gold leaf. We would always sit in what my mother would call the loge, which was right below the balcony, because that was where she loved to sit. And so we would always sit right above the stage so we could see the orchestra, but then you could see everything on the stage. And it was just a magical experience. And I wanted, on some level, I mean, initially that passage was much, much longer.
Mm.
But then I realized that we needed to edit it down. I did this whole huge sort of elaborate description of what the lobby looked like.
Yeah.
But then I realized, oh, I can just use a couple of telling words and the audience will get the idea of what the boys are experiencing. Yeah.
And that's something I noticed all through the work, the telling detail. This is something that indicates a character, indicates a situation, something, a little tiny observation again. There's that camera eye of yours, making a really wonderful thing. And I have to do this. I have to ask you, one of the delights is the little Easter eggs that you put in here. And one of the instances particularly clever, the boys of Bungalow Terrace at one point are on a well-known talk show, and you share that
Yeah.
the other guests were stage and film actress Eve Harrington,
Right.
best-selling author
Yes.
Allison Mackenzie, and movie star Neely O'Hara. And this is really a great concept. Because this is a work of fiction, you can easily include famous fictional characters from other genres. So Eve Harrington was in All About Eve. Allison Mackenzie was played by Mia Farrow in Peyton Place. Neely O'Hara was a character in Valley of the Dolls. That was just magnificent. I got that and went, oh, wow, that is well. Thank you for putting that in.
Well, you're welcome. You're welcome. I want to be clear, though. These are not these these characters do not do anything in the book.
No.
They have nothing to do with the story, the plot line, or the other characters. But I did that simply because these were three pieces that were very influential in my own, sort of growing up period.
Mhm.
I remember the first time that I had read the novel Peyton Place, and it just was sort of very changing for me at the time. And the same thing with the novel Valley of the Dolls, and also when I first saw the movie All About Eve.
Mhm.
Just they spoke to me on some visceral level, and I really just wanted to include that to sort of pay homage to how influential they were in terms of my own experience and my own writing. I wanted to pay homage to, Grace Metalius and to Mankiewicz and to Jacqueline and Suzanne, just to say thank you. Because I don't think I could have written Bungalow Terrace if I hadn't been exposed to those previous pieces of work.
One of the characters, I mean, each of the characters is fascinating, well-rounded, and have their own particular problems and their own particular skills. But I'm thinking about Kevin particularly, who struggles with terms with his sexuality at a time when being gay was illegal and labeled a mental disease, and the horrible, I don't want to give away too many plot points, but there is a
Right,
horrible session of what is absolutely misnamed as reorientation therapy or conversion therapy.
right.
And I certainly hope that was not part of your personal experience.
No, no, it wasn't. I mean, Kevin's coming out story was inspired by my own coming out story to an extent,
Mhm.
but it is completely fictional. But when I became when I went into puberty, when puberty started for me, um, uh, being gay was still illegal in the United States, and it was still listed on the books as a mental disease. What I attributed to is I say to people, think of the worst thing you could possibly be accused of in society today, like the absolute most heinous thing you could be accused of being, and that's what it was like to be exposed as being gay back then. And when I started becoming aware of my own personal sexuality, um, it was not something that I could discuss or sort of expose to anybody else,
Mhm.
simply because it was considered so abhorrent. And so my only recourse was to deny it, to suppress it, and pretend that it didn't exist, which was very complicated and very difficult. And, it took a long time for me to sort of relinquish all of that shame that I felt around it. And I wanted to include that into Kevin's story. But I also wanted to really make a statement about the fact that so many people, even today, people of my generation, your generation, they were not even aware that being gay was illegal. I did a book club not too long ago. There were about 10 different people in the book club. And they had asked me to come and be part of their discussion group. And they were all of a specific age. And every single one of them said, I had no idea that it was illegal. So it was something that was so just sort of, just kept under the covers, just sort of swept under the rug. And, what would happen to a lot of people back then who were exposed, they would be subjected to these institutions and they would be put through these aversion therapies.
Mhm.
I remember I'd seen on PBS this interview with this gentleman who actually went through something very similar to what Kevin goes through in the book. And it affected me in such a deep place that I felt it's essential for people to know that this is what happens. I mean, this is what people went through in order to, sort of get us to the place that we are today. I think we still have a long way to go, but that kind of acceptance that we now sort of take for granted in terms of the LGBTQ community on some level. That was a very long and very difficult and very tragic road.
Mhm. But writing it was it cathartic in another way for you?
Yeah.
Mhm.
I'm sorry, say it again.
We were cathartic for you to write that.
Oh my God. Oh, absolutely. It was very, very cathartic. It was cathartic for me to write a lot of the things I wrote in the book.
Mhm.
But it was very cathartic for me to write that, to put that on paper, to speak that, that sort of beginning in a place of such shame to a place of acceptance and a place of healing, a place of, it was very, very cathartic for me to write that.
Mhm.
And I really wanted to be honest about it. And I really had to sort of delve into some feelings that I had not felt in a very long time. Experiences I hadn't really, certainly experiences that I had reconciled. I
Mhm.
mean, in my own personal journey, I think that I have sort of exorcised most of those demons. But it's never particularly comforting to have to go back and revisit some of that stuff. But
Mhm.
I thought I needed to do that in order to write the story. And in retrospect, it was wonderful for me because there were certain things that I thought that I had reconciled, which I feel now I really have sort of put to bed. I think it serves the story, but it also served me personally as a writer and as a human being to sort of really delve into that particular topic and explore it in such detail. Um, yeah, it was a wonderful experience. It really, really was.
One of the reasons that I love writing books, and I read a lot of books, is to find out something about something that I have not personally experienced, to get the inside. This is what really happens when you do this or that or whatever. This was very moving to me as basic, cis white guy, to feel that feelings that you did or you were able to get your character Kevin to feel. So I think you're doing a real service to a larger community by including that in the book.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I really believe that that's where empathy comes from, understanding the foundational experiences of other people. and understanding, sort of taking a walk in their particular shoes.
Mhm.
Um, I mean, being able to do that, you then sort of understand where they're coming from. I didn't just want to write a book about what and who. I really wanted to write a book about why. Because
Mhm.
until you understand the why, you really don't understand what motivates um, somebody's actions. I mean, we're all human. We all have foibles. We all have certainly wonderful, great attributes. But then, there are also attributes that may not be particularly, appealing or particularly, uh, uh, in our best interest. And I just wanted to really get, to the point where people really understood what these people were experiencing, so that there would be some sort of empathy for them, some understanding, and sort of maybe they could look at their own experience or the way that they perceive something or their particular perspective, and that perspective can be changed, because that's one of the huge themes of the book, is that a miracle is just a shift in perception. How you perceive something is how you will experience it, and you can change the experience of something by shifting your perception. And a lot of times, we all have these sort of perceived ideas about one thing or another, maybe something that we really don't have a lot of experience with, or even a lot of education or knowledge on, and we just sort of go with that. But then our perceptions are shifted uh, once we're engaged in that particular experience.
What do you hope when they close the book they take away from them, with them?
Yeah, well, first and foremost, I hope that it's entertaining to people. I certainly hope that people enjoy reading the book. And as I had mentioned, one of my uh, goals was to create a certain amount of empathy and understanding for the characters and their situation. But I think, once again, the two things I really hope that people come away with is, first and foremost, that forgiveness is our greatest tool. That until you actually choose the act of forgiveness, whatever it is that you're struggling with will consistently inform and define every decision that you make, from the most mundane to the most profound. But once you choose forgiveness, whether it's for yourself or for someone else, that burden, that trauma is literally lifted from you and you're free. And then, once again, what I just mentioned, that a miracle is just a shift in perception. Um, and that, how you perceive something is how you will experience something. I'm a firm believer that the energy that you put out is the energy that will come back to you. And I don't believe that's some sort of metaphysical philosophy. I mean, that's just physics. I mean, that's science. So what you put out is what will come back to you. So we all have a choice as to how we choose to behave in the world. And if something is not necessarily serving you, chances are, if you just shift your perception about it, then you will have a totally different experience of it, because that shift can define whether or not your experience is going to be positive or negative. So I think that's really what I want people to come away from, are those two particular philosophies or ideologies.
Isn't It seems to me it resonated to me when I read the book. I said, in the end, the love you take is equal to the love you make, which is a line from the Beatles. And it seems to me that's your perception all the way through.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And it's interesting because I started the book with Gloria, and then because it was interesting, because when you're first beginning something that you're not a professional at,
Mhm.
you start sort of asking questions and going to certain resources. And there were certain resources that kept insisting that you never start a novel with a secondary character. But I knew that the novel needed to start with Gloria.
Yeah.
And so, Gloria is the mother of one of the four boys in the
Mhm.
group. And as I was writing the novel, there was a period where I was having, even in terms of the outline, I was questioning the ending.
Mhm.
And I wasn't really sure, is this the right way to end it? Is that the right way? I mean, I knew the ending for the boys, but I was like, but I don't think the ending of their particular story necessarily is the ending of the novel. And all of a sudden, just, out of nowhere, I literally think I was driving in the car. It came to me. It said, wait a minute. You began the book with Gloria. you end the book with Gloria.
Yes.
And the beginning chapter is called Beginnings, and it's, the end chapter is called Endings.
Yeah.
And I said, oh, and then it just all sort of fell into place.
Yeah. And there's a
Um,
real satisfaction to the conclusion of the book. When sometimes you put a book, as you mentioned before, and you go, I still have questions. I'm still on. Yours wraps up very, very nicely. Not necessarily everybody gets everything they want, but it
right.
wraps up satisfactorily as a conclusion to a story as well. And since you started, I want to mention that the beginning is actually, you get some class struggle in here right from the get-go, and some, because Gloria's trying to enroll her son Steve into a Catholic school, and they're down on her because she's divorced. Oh my goodness.
Right.
And that introduced us to some tension right away, but also gave a lot of background and feel to your story. So I appreciate that a great deal.
Oh, you're welcome. Well, yeah, I mean, everything that takes place in the beginning part of the book in the Catholic school is inspired by, I went 12 years to a Catholic school.
Aha.
So, I mean, that's an arena that I know like the back of my hand. And I went to a Catholic school in the 1960s and early 1970s. So that experience was something very familiar to me.
Mhm.
And the rigidity of that particular dogma at that time, particularly in the case of divorce,
Oh, yes.
was something that was sort of drummed into our heads. I do remember one time in the class that there was actually there was a priest. This fellow student of mine, his parents were divorced, and we started some sort of discussion, and he brought that up, and the priest kept insisting that there was no such thing as divorce, which was somewhat confusing for this student because his
Yeah.
parents were divorced,
Yeah.
and it was just looked on, so negatively at that particular time, particularly a woman. I
Mhm.
mean, unfortunately, sometimes the same experience is looked on very differently between men and women.
Yes,
And
exactly.
if you were a divorcee back in the late, 1950s, um,
Oh,
the
yeah.
judgment, society's judgment was
Yes.
extreme.
Yes.
And I really wanted to sort of start the book with that, because that sort of sets up the whole foundation of where these boys are coming from in terms of, their foundational experiences, and uh, um, um, you know, uh, what brings them to where it is that they end up going.
This is a question I never get a chance to ask this before to a real life casting director. Have you cast the book in your mind for when the movie comes out?
Um, I have not necessarily. A lot of people ask me that question. It's sort of interesting that when I was writing the book, I had some very specific actors in mind.
Mhm.
Um, but some of them, unfortunately, have passed on. For example, when I was writing Colin, um, to go back to Peyton Place a little bit, sort of the physical image I had in my mind was of Jeffrey Chandler.
Oh my, yeah, yeah.
And I think maybe that was because in the film Return to Peyton Place, he plays the book editor. But
Mhm.
for some reason, I always had him in mind. When I was writing Sheila, there was a very wonderful, well, she's still a wonderful actress, but I mean, there was an actress, she was very popular in the early 70s, an actress called Karen Allen.
Mhm.
And I sort of had her physically in mind when I was writing Sheila. So, I mean, I did have some people in mind when I was writing it, but after the fact, I'll be honest with you, I have not kept as up to date as I guess I should have with all of the wonderful, young actors and actresses out today. So I haven't necessarily cast it because I'm not as familiar with the talent pool as I once was.
Right. Fascinating stuff. Anyway, um, you also, I have a must have a background in music as well, because all of the stuff about singing and harmony and the different parts. Do you sing in a choir or a chorus as well?
Well, when I was in junior high school, I was in the school chorus.
Hmm.
I do not have a background. My older brother is an astute musician, and he also owns a recording studio. But I I was never a musician, and I'll be very very honest with you. When it comes to harmony, that's a big trick for me. I
Mm.
can never seem to like get it correctly. I mean, obviously when I first went to New York, my intention was to be a performer. And so, I did a bit of musical theater. I mean, so I could sing, but I would never define my experience as being a musician. or being immersed in that particular world. That was another part of the research that I had to do. Um, uh, but the reason I think primarily is I needed, because I wanted to set it in show business, because that's certainly an arena that I knew.
Yeah.
And I wanted to write what I knew. And then I thought to myself, well, what in show business would keep four people together for a significant period of time? Because Bungalow Terrace spans 50 years. Um, and, I said, well, even if they had a long running television show, I mean, it's rare that a television show would last more than 10 years. So I said, well, a singing group, and the novel starts out when they're children. So, I mean, they have this friendship, because the book, first and foremost, to me, is a friendship saga. And they create this bond and this brotherhood and this friendship, even before they're sort of developed into this group. So I knew that even amidst the trials and tribulations of that particular setup, that bond would always be the foundation of their story. But I really said it has to be a singing group, because that's really the only construct that would keep them together for that long period of time.
And you have people like ZZ Top and the Rolling Stones that were together for 50 years, and Stones are still together, whatnot.
Exactly.
So there are that examples out there. But what's interesting too is, as again, as a disc jockey, following the changes in music as they go from doo-wop to the English invasion to the 70s disco and all of that. So you may not be a musician yourself, but you're certainly a student of music.
Oh, well, absolutely. I mean, there was always music playing in our house. I mean, my foundational influences began in the 60s. My parents loved music. I mean, we always had a record player. There were always records being played in the house. And it was a diversity. I mean, one day you could come in and listen and be hearing David Bowie, and the next day you could come in and be listening to Judy Garland. I mean, the variety of music that was played. My father was a huge country fan, Dixieland fan. My mother loved all the Italian singers, but she also loved whatever was new. I mean, it was my mother who introduced all of us to the Beatles, and I remember distinctly watching that episode on Ed Sullivan. I remember it was Sunday, and we were having dinner early. And I asked my mother, I said, why are we eating so early? And she said, the Beatles are on the Ed Sullivan show. And at the time, I didn't know who the Beatles were. I was a little kid, and I thought, like, are they puppets, like Beatles? What are we watching? So there was always, rock, everything from rock and roll to Dixieland to standards. I mean, everything was played in the house. And so it gave me an enormous appreciation of music, particularly at that time. And then when, I started growing up, then my own taste started changing, particularly in the 70s and in the 80s. I sort of developed my own particular taste, and everything in the late 70s, was influenced by disco. I mean, even, huge rockers like Mick Jagger would incorporate some aspect of it in their rock music because it was so influential after Saturday Night Fever. And, a lot of people sort of dipped their toe into that, and it was not a particularly satisfying experience. And there were some huge disasters too. I mean, sometimes you just go back and you look at some of the people who put out disco albums, and you were like, what were they thinking? And I really wanted to incorporate that in the book. But I wanted people to understand why the group would sort of go in that direction. And so I really decided, well, what was it about disco that was so appealing to a mass audience, particularly in this country? And I realized, it's the syncopated rhythm. It's the harmonies that can be created. I mean, there was an attraction to it. So, but, in the book, that's without giving a plot point, that's not the most satisfying experience that the group has, success, professionally.
Exactly. And the disco, I remember, because I was working radio at the time, the Disco is Dead movement came slamming through at one point, and then you couldn't sell disco for anything.
Right. Exactly. And how a group, a successful group transcends that.
Hmm.
I mean, I thought that was also an interesting thing to explore.
Yeah. I have to ask about future projects because I see so much in this that I want to read more from you soon. How far are we in book number two?
Well, I will be honest, I have written the first four chapters of the second book,
All right.
which have nothing to do with Bungalow Terrace.
Right.
And it's almost kind of the antithesis to Bungalow Terrace, where Bungalow Terrace spans 50 years. This new book takes place over one single summer.
Ah,
Bungalow Terrace has four male uh, lead characters. The protagonist to my second novel is a single female.
ah.
So it's very, very different.
Uh-huh.
And without giving really much away, because it's in the beginning stages, it takes place in the summer of 1992 at a somewhat third-rate, non-equity musical dinner theater.
We've all been there at one time or another.
Yes.
Right. I think.
So I have begun. I've written the first four chapters, and so we will see where that goes.
Well, if you can bring the kind of comprehensive, multifaceted talent you did with this one, we'll have no problem. And I'm delighted to be here at the beginning of your career and to snag this interview with you because this is gonna be something we're gonna be very proud of down the road. I want to make sure that we have all the information. Do we have a talk about the website, blog, anything we want to steer them toward?
Yeah, my website is robertmonroeauthor.com. Monroe is Monroe, like Maryland.
Mhm.
Robertmonroeauthor.com. I'm certainly on Facebook and Instagram. You can follow me on Bungalow Terrace by Robert Monroe. That's the handle for both my Instagram and my Facebook social media. I mean, the book is certainly available on my website. It's certainly available in your local bookstore. If for some reason your local bookstore doesn't have it, they'd be happy to order it. You can certainly order it on Amazon. And you can order it on my publisher's website if you want to look at the rest of their catalog, and that's mainauthorpublishing.com.
All right. Our guest today has been Robert Monroe. The book is Bungalow Terrace. I give it the highest possible recommendation. Thank you so much for being generous with your time.
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed it, Roger. Thank you so much.